Welcome to the Atheist Podcast. I'm Erin.
And I'm Kelley. Atheist is where we will explore American cultural trends through the lenses of a devout theist
and a devout atheist. We will discuss the messiness of being human,
the latest in social science, psychology, and American culture,
and what any of it has to do with Homo sapiens' longtime preoccupation with religion. We are so excited to have Dr. Patrick Hill with us today. He is an associate professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. His research examines how sense of purpose may promote coping with stressors, as well as engagement and health-promoting behaviors. He is also interested in the role of personality dispositions on daily and long-term cognitive resilience.
Welcome.
Maybe we could just kind of start actually with getting to know you a little bit more. I mean, we have familiarized ourselves with your research, but we would love to know more about you, how you grew up. It looks like maybe you're an Indiana guy. I don't know, at least from an education standpoint. So can we start there?
Sure. Yes. Thanks for inviting me. This is a lot of fun. And yeah, I grew up in just outside of Indianapolis and lived most of my life, at least through graduate school, in the state of Indiana. So went to Indiana University. I'm huge IU fan. I loved my experience there and getting to first learn about like psychology and start to think about these topics back at IU, which I had no desire to go into psychology whatsoever before college. So that was kind of a refreshing and new perspective for me. Beyond that, I went to the University of Notre Dame for graduate school. And when I was at Notre Dame is kind of where we started exploring and started to understand what it meant to know yourself, what it meant to know what your identity is. And part of that process is what we'll be talking about today in terms of figuring out if you have a direction in life and trying to find this kind of purpose that might guide you from day to day. So for instance, back then, like we did a lot of work with college students, because college students are a very critical sample for trying to think through, who am I, where am I going? And as I just said, this is kind of how I found myself, was during the college experience at IU and figuring out what I really valued and what I really was interested in. So a lot of our work at Notre Dame was interested in how people develop a purpose and goals for life as part of the university experience, and trying to see how that impacted them for the next 20, 30, 40 years after graduation. So Notre Dame is kind of where I started on this path to purpose. Afterwards, did postdoctoral work at the University of Illinois, and then ended up teaching for a little bit up at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. So it was another eye-opening experience in a lot of ways to figure out, again, who am I? What are my values? Like trying to reconstitute and reconnect the self across different environments. And it's really kind of a fascinating process to try to figure out how you identify at different points and in different places. So that was kind of my firsthand lived experience of thinking through who I am. And now I'm back in the States teaching here at Washington University in St. Louis. And we do a lot of work focused on purpose development, and particularly with respect to how individuals find purpose through their lived experience, whether it's through unfortunate experiences with discrimination or marginalization, whether it's through experiences with health outcomes, as well as kind of the natural developmental experiences that we all have, and figuring out who you are during adolescence, and then trying to figure out who you are again in retirement after you might have lost that thing that was guiding you from day to day. So I don't know if that answered who I am is a tough question. So I don't know if that answered
That's what
it.
you do, right?
Yeah, that's what I do. Yeah.
Patrick, part of this podcast is our different views in terms of our theism and our kind of religious and spiritual lens on the world. So I'm curious if you had a religious or spiritual upbringing that helped to push you towards this kind of research.
I did not. I was not really raised in a religious background or with a religious upbringing. It's been interesting to get to experience some of these religious and spiritual viewpoints almost secondhand. Like when I went to the University of Notre Dame, which of course is a Catholic school, I got to see how that was shaping the lives of the people around me and so forth. And now we actually do quite a bit of work in the lab around how for some people, religion can serve as that like guidepost or that way of directing you towards your purpose and values. But if you pardon the pun, I try to stay rather agnostic myself on all of this to be unbiased in the research. Yeah.
Interesting. So when you have your lab, what is can you sort of explain to us, like, what is that like? How do you conduct your research? You're bringing in participants, and those are conversations, they're questionnaires. How do you sort of discover purpose, and how do you measure it?
Great question. Yeah, I know. I have two young nieces, and when they first got to come to my lab, they were very disappointed that it wasn't like a bunch of chemicals and beakers and explosions. So it's not a lab like that. But what we often do is kind of a combination of different methods to try to uncover how people describe themselves and their direction. So one way is we collect a lot of samples across the country, across the world, in which we send out surveys online asking them, like, for instance, some of our typical measures for sense of purpose. We might ask you, like, how much do you agree with the statement, like, I have a direction in my life, or I have a clear purpose in my life, versus do you agree more with things that say, like, I'm kind of more aimless in my life, or I don't really have a good idea of what I do from one day to the next. So one way we get about this is through self-report measures like that, where they have their pros and cons. Of course, the pro is I can send it out to hundreds of people and get some basic feedback pretty quickly. But as you alluded to, Erin, another aspect of our lab is to start doing more in-depth interviews. So for instance, a number of our studies ask people to really dive into the topic of, like, what does it mean to you to have a purpose in life? How does your work influence that? How does your art? We've been doing a study now with artists here in St. Louis and trying to ask them about their purpose and direction, and whether the arts provide that purpose, whether individuals might be using the arts as a means towards other areas, like social justice or helping others, or other types of aims that they see that as their purpose. And it's really critical to kind of combine these interview methods with these self-report methods, because it's such a big amorphous thing. That for each of us, for every single person in the world, you probably have a slightly different purpose or direction from anybody else. So there's an individual component, but there is still a component that we can kind of isolate, where regardless of the fact that three of us may have different things directing us through life, we still may feel the sense of direction. And that's part of our work too, is getting at the like sense of purpose in addition to what the purpose is, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. I just did the Science of Well-being course, the Laurie Santos course.
Yeah.
And so in that class they have us at the very beginning take I think it's the PERMA test, and then the authentic happiness measure, which I from what I understand comes from Martin Seligman's research and his from the University of Pennsylvania. And so what I was thinking as I was like looking at your research, it's almost like it seemed to me like it was a one of the legs of the PERMA model, if you will, but you're kind of drilling really specifically into sense of purpose as one of the pieces of the puzzle. Is that a good way to think about it?
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking of it, that we I guess it helps that one way that we often define purpose is thinking of it as this kind of overarching life aim that helps to direct you from one day to the next, and helps you to give this engagement to your life and this agency to your life. And as you note, like that's something that could help people find happiness and well-being. So if you think of it as a leg or a predictor of happiness, psychological health, and so forth. But one thing that we like to note is, you put it nicely, it's one leg. Like, it's not necessarily the case that if you're listening to this and you're like, oh gosh, I have no idea what my purpose is, that doesn't mean that you're not going to live a happy life or live a life in which you're feeling connected to others or so forth. It's just it's one of the factors, in addition to several other factors, that predict better health and better development. And we like to tell people, like when I go out and give talks about purpose, like you can almost see people shutting down at the very beginning, because it is that kind of existential dread of some sort of like, what is my purpose in life? I have no idea. And now this guy's talking about how great it is. I'm in deep trouble. But this is one, getting back to the previous discussion, this is one reason why a lot of our studies focus on this kind of sense of purpose, that even if you can't say right now, like, my purpose in life is blank, you might be able to agree, like, oh, I kind of agree with the idea that I have this sense of direction, or I kind of agree with the idea that I have worthwhile activities I engage in. And what's good is that seems to be the part that's the like defining or integral piece towards happiness, well-being, positive development, more so than like having a clear articulation of like, my purpose in life is blah 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 blah.
Right.
So sorry for droning on, Erin, but
No.
your point is exactly what we like to mention, is like, this sense of purpose is one way towards happiness, and hopefully you don't get too dismayed when you're having difficulty trying to figure out what that is.
I'm super curious about the research with artists. I'm been a theater teacher for 27 years, and a theater artist and actor in town. And I'm transitioning into what I do now, which is spiritual direction. So I've been really interested in kind of how people develop spiritually and how they change in terms of their understanding. But then also it got me kind of doing my own little, very small research around, like, how do people change as artists? Does their purpose in life change as they kind of, get older and stuff? And so I just asked some friends, and I had this one person tell me this story, and I thought, I'm curious what you would say to this. A casting agent said to him once, sometimes when you figure out why you're an actor, you don't need to be one anymore. And that idea,
yeah. I love
fascinated
that.
me ever just, yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting you put it that way, because I think first off, I'm very connected. Like I've always been influenced by the arts and trying to figure out how artists develop the way they do. Like my mother was an art teacher for like 38 years, and she was very influenced by the arts. But to your point, a lot of the reason she stuck with her career and continued down her direction um, was because it was a way of connecting and educating children and giving back to the future generation in that sense of like that was her mechanism for doing that. And I don't know whether she would say like her purpose is specifically about the arts as much as it was education. And what you're alluding to is some of the stuff that we're already hearing in these interviews where the arts have been relatively understudied in our field, in part because it's kind of a tricky area to understand, like the motivations as well as to characterize what purposeful activity looks like compared to other fields. So, for me, purposeful activity is like I did a morning Zoom meeting. We're having this podcast. I'm going to go meet my graduate students afterwards. Like there's a clear chain of events that kind of is a typical day for me in terms of these meetings. Whereas, a lot of my friends in the arts community, it'll be like a very jam-packed couple of weeks when they're doing a show, and then it might not be a lot for a while. Or people in the visual arts, we think about all these stories of inspiration and trying to produce something in the moment, whereas there might be a block or a writer's block, thinking of the written arts for a while. And all that to say, like, it's been a very important part, like personally for me, but also trying to understand how do you discuss goal-directed engagement in daily life with individuals whose purpose may lead them to more of these spans of time in between. And I think the final thing related to your point, this relates actually quite a lot to our research around retirement. So we find that individuals who are retired, like there's a vulnerability. I shouldn't say that everybody who retires loses purpose, but there's certainly a vulnerability for people in retirement to kind of lose a sense of direction or lose a sense of what they're doing. And one of the programs or one of the recommendations that we often make is like, figure out why you were doing that job before. Because there's a lot of reasons, turning back to my mom, she then went and did some temporary positions like substitute teaching. She went and became very focused on grandparenting and educating my nieces. And you can see like she had a more successful transition than others because you could find the why behind that job and then carry that through, even if the job itself is no longer available to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
That resonates big time with me right now. Yeah. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah. I wonder about too, like those different life transitions. So retirement being one of them. I was just having a conversation over the weekend about just talking to some other parents that have young kids and talking about, what are we going to do with our time when they go to college and we don't have all of these like events that we're running around. But you hear about that when empty nesters, like, okay, they're looking, they look at each other and they're kind of like, what is our identity? It's been sort of wrapped up in this. And then you think about that transition into and out of college or different you change jobs and that sort of thing, like all of those different moments of transition. I think I like the way that you phrased it, that there are vulnerable moments in life where you might feel like lost, and how is it that people sort of find that get back on track or get back on a path for where they feel that meaning and purpose in their lives?
Yeah, it's something that's really been essential to our research that, so often we get asked questions about like, at what age does this happen? Or at what age does this happen? And more of our work is showing like chronological age is such a poor way of describing this for exactly like it's more of the transitory moments that are somewhat tied to age, but also tied to life experiences and the social roles you're taking on and so forth. And it's been interesting to do like in combination with Dr. Kaylin Ratner at Illinois and Dr. Anthony Burrow at Cornell, we've been kind of playing with this construct and idea that fits nicely with what you just said regarding a perception of like derailment, like this sense that you had a direction and now you've kind of fallen off. And we see this a lot, here at university. We see a lot of students who perhaps, their whole lives they were going to be doctors or something, and then med school just isn't working out. And now, who am I? Why was I interested in med school in the first place? And you see this with transitory periods where people, first have kids or the kids move out. You transition to grandparenthood or not. You transition to having a partner or not. And I think these are periods where, the good news for us is our research on derailment shows it's not a terribly common phenomenon or like it's not that over half the public feels derailed in their lives or anything like that. But it certainly is something that we've been alerting clinical psychologists and mental health professionals to, in terms of if you have difficulty connecting who you are now to who you used to be, there is that issue that we all kind of have. Getting back to the who am I question, like how did this kid who grew up in Indianapolis end up here? If you can't make that kind of thread, even if it's not, most of our lives are not linear, but you can at least make a non-linear thread. We know that helps out when it comes to mental health and mental well-being. And I think this is why those transitory periods become so important, that we've been trying to understand how derailment occurs. And it's definitely not the case that individuals there's no one event that leads everybody to feeling derailed, which is good for us. Like it's not like getting divorced or having a health issue necessarily leads people to feeling derailed. In fact, there's quite a bit of resilience around these events. But there's definitely a case where people who get so tied up in one direction may have difficulty when there is something thwarting that path. And in some cases, this is where like we don't see a lot of this in our work, but we always say like there is always an extreme for any construct in psychology. And you can imagine like extreme purposefulness could be problematic for you if something comes along the way that just throws you off.
If you're not agile.
If you're not, if you're not agile, if you're not flexible. And it's something we're still wrestling with, but it definitely seems to be around these transition periods. And you could even see this with college students at times regarding some of our early work showed college seniors sometimes report the lowest levels of purpose of any year during college. And part of that is like, oh, bleep, I have to go do something now. I have to go figure out what my next step is. And we were seeing like these trends where college seniors tended to score about as high or maybe even lower than college first year students, because it was kind of that transitory period, whereas the students in the middle sometimes score higher.
As you say that,
further away.
I actually remember feeling that way. I remember feeling kind of more like, at like just lost at that threshold moment. but that's the thing, right? So there's these threshold moments, and then people can either be derailed or not. And I know you do, there's research around personality and types of, what have you found there in terms of who's most likely to be derailed?
Yeah. We haven't actually found, like, when it comes to personality traits or like individual different dispositions, it's not like there is a profile of like, oh, somebody who's very agreeable or extroverted, like they're the ones, like that doesn't seem to be as much of a case as things that might make sense in terms of, individuals who have some predisposition towards maybe feeling depressive symptoms, feeling anxious, like maybe more likely to be rattled in these moments. And one thing that our lab is really focused on currently is coping mechanisms and regulatory skills, and those definitely play a role with respect to some people. Like, we could all think of people in our lives who are just better at adapting to something that comes up or a roadblock that happens. And what's nice for us is individuals with a higher sense of purpose tend to be better at coping with things that come along their way, and coping with things more adaptively, I should say. We all cope in some mechanism,
in some way.
Yeah.
But it then becomes tricky that if you had this very clear purpose in life and some major obstacle comes up, like, there's still a lot of research that's needed in terms of, you could think of prominent athletes or somebody who had a very clear path, and then an injury happens. That's kind of like what happens now. There's still a lot of work that's needed for those kinds of major obstacles that are very purpose relevant and like literally stop you in your path.
Yeah. What are some of those coping mechanisms that people had describe, or that maybe that you see patterns in, right? That you're like, okay, many people mention this. Do you see patterns in that are effective?
Yeah. So one caveat to start is that, the coping literature, we always say that there's no one way to tackle every problem. Like, there's no one strategy that's going to be perfect for everyone. That being said, I can tell you that, like, individuals who report having a stronger sense of purpose tend to be people who are more problem-focused copers, people who kind of address issues rather than casting them aside or letting them build up or avoiding the problem. My former graduate student, Dr. Gabrielle Fund, has been doing a lot of work on how people with a stronger sense of purpose also tend to be better at finding like silver linings or finding like the positive in the negative at times. And that in addition to those kinds of strategies, there's of course times where you don't necessarily want to be as problem focused. Like, if you're always attacking a problem head on, that also could overexert you or lead you to improperly use up all your resources. So at times we also see a lot of benefits, of course, with social connections and social support, of being able to call upon people. Even if you don't call upon them, it's valuable to be able to know there is someone to call upon. And that seems to be another integral mechanism linking purpose to well-being, is people with a stronger sense of purpose typically report more positive social relationships, more positive connections, and support from a lot of the primary people in their lives. So this may be something too where we like to be around people who are more goal-directed rather than people who are more aimless, and that kind of helps to build the support.
Yeah. One of the researchers that we learned about in the course that I took was Sonia Lubomirsky. I think I'm saying her name right.
Yes, I think you are.
She I guess was kind of she had this pie chart, which I thought was kind of nice, but it was like that, 50% is sort of your biology or your genetics, maybe sort of like your sort of predisposition to be glass half full, glass half empty, kind of describing the silver lining, that you're maybe more oriented in being able to look for those silver linings, those sorts of things. And then 10% is the things that happen to you, right? These derailments that everyone faces at different points, and they all come in their own unique and different varieties of those derailments. And then 40% is really this intentional activity. So I wondered about one of the things I keep thinking about lately is just how much cultivating certain kinds of habits are, lead people to, better well-being. So whether that, and I'm kind of wondering about how we apply that to sense of purpose. Like, what are habits that we can kind of cultivate for ourselves that would lead us to find that? If that's a way to phrase it, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to, like, we've actually been just working on this idea very recently, that we've published a couple articles around habits, and the idea, like, just generally being, again, trying to, like, we hate using find because none of us get to our purpose on our own, but trying to cultivate a purpose. That cultivating a purpose is such a daunting task that, we like to recommend that people may want to start at kind of the bottom up. So if you think about your own lives, maybe they're like, this activity that I did, or this experience I had, made me feel like this momentary sense of like, oh, I feel a direction, I feel productive, I feel like I'm doing something that matters to me. And we think about this as kind of like a state level of purpose, that in the state, in the moment, you feel kind of purposeful. And then once you can reflect upon that, like take the moment to figure out over the last week, what were those activities? What we've been suggesting is exactly what you were pointing to, of start planning your week, start making activities in which you make those into habits. Like, if there is an activity that really makes you feel directed, that should be something that you spend more of your time doing. So in my own personal life, like, it's really important to me, like it's something that really matters to me, to be able to mentor young scientists, to mentor early career researchers. And I spend more of my schedule around being in my lab, talking to my students, than some of my peers who might be more focused on other, like the 78 other things that we do as professors. But so I think that's kind of where we can see, like, from the moment to the habit, like you start to build this activity and make it something that you do frequently. And over time, like, once you start to identify, like, oh, I'm spending a lot of time doing this, maybe that helps me to figure out, this might be my direction. This might be the thing that guides me from day to day, because I've just spent my week organizing myself around these activities. And it works the opposite way too. Like, if you have a purpose in life that is like, okay, I've identified that I really want to make a difference in science. How do I do that? Well, let's build my week. Let's build these habits where I'm going into the office, I'm conducting research, I'm talking to colleagues. And then those kind of lead to these momentary experiences, like, oh, I'm going to be on a podcast and talk about science. This makes me feel purposeful in the moment. This is kind of a reinforcing principle of like, yeah, this maybe is the direction for me in life that I'm going down. So I love your question, your point here, that it's not, again, it's not necessarily that we're suggesting anything new or like reinventing the wheel. Clinicians, therapists have been talking about this for years, of schedule your life around what matters to you. And that's one way to start figuring out, what is it that's big thing that's up above all of us, directing us from day to day. So
something you said that I think is really interesting is this need to be able to identify the state of purpose. And I think that's where so many of us get stuck, right?
Yeah.
We don't know what that feels like. And I think about, the problem of like workism, and that so many of us identify that state of purpose with work. And while that's, possible, I know that can probably get us in trouble too. And I don't know, the David Brooks article in the Atlantic a couple weeks ago on the new old age. I don't know if you're, that article. And I know, so the article talks about these different programs for people in that transition phase in retirement, and how, and I know, your alma mater is one of the 3 programs that has one of those programs. I'm wondering if you at Wash U, if you guys have thought about anything kind of like that.
So we've been engaged in a few different initiatives that are starting to scratch the surface on this front. So one thing that we've been doing, I've been a part of this program that's led by the public health school here to do often night courses or afternoon courses for older adults, providing this kind of lifelong education program where, I went in and talked about purpose and derailment and all these things to individuals there, and tried to help them find, like, okay, what am I doing now in retirement? So that I think part of what university can provide, hopefully, are these experiences that allow people to continue learning throughout the lifespan. In addition to this, we were doing this more pre-pandemic. Unfortunately, we haven't picked it up again, of going to retirement communities, and I know there's a program at WashU that in fact involve students living in and visiting retirement communities to help be activity planners and help be kind of support mechanisms for getting people engaged and getting people excited to work together, to play together and be together. So I think some of these opportunities are percolating. Unfortunately, like I share your sentiment that there should be a lot more of these things. But when we think ahead to these kinds of activities, one thing that seems to really matter is this intergenerational component of it, that towards older adulthood, what we see is a lot of individuals who are hoping to make a difference with others, to make a difference with future generations, and this could be an opportunity of going into these communities, being able to work with them, to help them feel purposeful and directed. Again, my former student, Dr. Fund, did some work showing, older adults felt more purposeful on days in which they had positive social interactions. So just having those social interactions matters, and being able to not feel kind of condensed in your, like how we all felt at the start of the pandemic, just like alone and stuck in our house and so forth. Like that, though we know social connections matter, and I think that, like, particularly intergenerational ones kind of matter.
Speaking of different generations, thinking about, I was just listening to Vivek Murthy, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, but as close as I can. He was on Expert on Expert with the Dak Shepard just recently. Okay. I mean, he's all over the place, right? He's recording interviews all the time, but as the leading healthcare professional in the country, really calling out
loneliness.
And related to mental health, and thinking about I think epidemic is maybe the right way to say it when it comes to young people really feeling lonely and really struggling. And I'm wondering about your research, what you are finding for, that Gen Z generation and younger. But I mean, I guess we could also just talk about, loneliness across the generations, because I think it's something that we're all affected by, but it definitely seems really acutely represented in that demographic.
Yeah, it's been something we've been trying to move more and more of our work towards. Like we published a few papers very recently around loneliness, given its strong importance. And something you mentioned towards the end there, it's certainly something that our research is showing is a critical health concern pretty much across the lifespan. Like it's not like, even if the pandemic context or other contexts have led to an increased vulnerability for younger adults, for adolescents, it strongly predicts a number of developmental outcomes through older adulthood and so forth. So a couple of things that we've been interested in is trying to understand the role of feeling this purpose and direction. And as you might expect, as we've kind of already alluded to, people who feel more purposeful, people who report a stronger sense of purpose, tend to also report feeling less lonely. And sense of purpose is not as tied to like having huge social networks as much as it is kind of like the perception that you have supportive networks, that you have people important to you. So it's not that purposeful people are going out and being like the most extroverted, gregarious people ever. It does seem to be that they cherish and hold on to those close ties. And what we've recently showed is like this association between sense of purpose and loneliness is very stable across the lifespan. Like it's a strong negative association from young adulthood all the way into 80s, 90s, and so forth. And, you can kind of see how this goes both ways. Primarily thus far, we've talked about how social support and social interactions are valuable for purpose, but also when you feel this sense of direction, when you feel a sense that you have goals in life that lead you to meaningful activities, when those meaningful activities are with people, that obviously helps to build your social connections. But also B, if you think about it in terms of whatever you're doing for your purpose, you didn't get there alone, and you aren't typically doing it alone. So even if you're not building friendships, like your purposeful aims usually matter to others in some way, and usually impact others in some way, whether that is intentional or not. Like getting back to the artist discussion, like there's a number of artists who might be producing work for their own, like this is for me to get to explore myself and my self-creation, but that doesn't mean the work isn't influencing others as well. So even times when you see a purpose that might seem more individual, it's usually impacting those around you. So there's that sense where producing purposeful activity usually likely leads people to feeling like they have more of a connection to others, whether it's clear, like I talked to this many people today or not. So there's one way that our research has been going of showing those kinds of what we would call bidirectional association. So like loneliness maybe impacts your purpose, but also purpose impacts your loneliness. The other thing that we've been doing is trying to see, like, for those individuals who feel a sense of purpose, does loneliness have less of a negative influence? So for instance, using a sample here in St. Louis, I'm part of a long-running study of middle to older adults living in the St. Louis city and county area. And my former student looked at whether sense of purpose may mitigate or buffer against some of the issues that loneliness provides. So as an example, we know that individuals in older adulthood who report higher loneliness are at greater risk for cognitive decline and greater risk for having cognitive issues. And what Gabrielle's work shows is individuals who feel that way, but also report a sense of purpose. Purpose may help to mitigate that risk a bit. That loneliness is not good. I'm not saying that, but loneliness may have less of a negative impact for those individuals who feel maybe a little lonely, but also feel like they still have this direction in life. So on both fronts, like this is very, again, recent work, very like a recent area of our research, but we are starting to find some evidence both for how sense of purpose and loneliness are influencing one another across the lifespan, as well as the potential for sense of purpose to maybe like taking 5 more steps from the research I just described, but sense of purpose could be one way of helping to influence and assist the lives of individuals, facilitate individuals who may be feeling a sense of loneliness in their lives. So if we can do these kinds of programs, like we were just mentioning, of build your life around purpose or build up these purposeful habits, that could play a role in helping to mitigate some of the issues. So
that's really interesting. This idea that you can do things that are solitary and that give you purpose, and then that can still kind of bring you to connection. I studied, I did a mindfulness training, and one of the things that I noticed in people who practice mindfulness, which is meditation and just self-awareness, very solitary thing, but one of the things I noticed in myself, and I've noticed in other people, is this greater sense of purpose and interest in service, and which, whether they do or not, it seems to have elevated a sense of purpose.
I get like a couple of things related to that we've been doing. One of which is like mindfulness, as you know, has such an interesting and complex influence on you, and we get a lot of questions about like, do these kinds of mindfulness retreats or interventions or programs help you to develop that purpose or develop a purpose in life? And it's interesting because when you consider some of the activities that you might have done as part of this mindfulness work, some elements are really valuable for finding this direction to your life, and then some elements of mindfulness are actually going counter, like this complete detachment from yourself, detachment from goals and so forth, can potentially run counter to the purpose exploration or development process, when we're trying to help you, like, okay, figure out exactly what matters to you, or figure out. So mindfulness is always something that comes up in some interesting ways back and forth. But regarding like the service component of it, my current postdoc, Megan Wilson, she's been looking into how this plays out with respect to social justice initiatives, and how some individuals find their purpose and direction through activism. And activist purpose is a fascinating topic, because it's not it's not community service or civic engagement in the like ways that we think about it from like high school experience. Like, I don't know about you, but our high school had like the required civic engagement, which that was definitely not activism. But it
plant a tree.
Plant something like that.
Yeah.
So it's been interesting to see this work where Dr. Wilson has been finding evidence that individuals who follow this kind of activist route to their purpose experience some things similar to civic engagement and community service. Like, they're still doing similar activities when it comes to political involvement and voting behavior and so forth. But it's one form of purpose or one direction for purpose where we see how purposeful direction can sometimes lead to, at least in the moment or in the week, some difficulties of course, struggling against systemic issues, struggling against the community that might have been built up in ways that you're actively going against, can lead to the potential or the vulnerability for greater anxiety, depression, anger. Like, of course, a lot of activist movements are built around the anger and distress with the society and with the issues that are plaguing us. And this is like it's a fascinating topic because that kind of service to a broader good and service to social change is very like has several positive elements, but also it's a struggle, and it's something that we're currently working around, of trying to think through how to help individuals in this struggle towards service when we have to like keep scaffolding them towards these important social goals and these important social directions.
I just did a program called At the Center of Action and Contemplation, and the whole thing behind it is, in order to do that activism work, you need to balance it with contemplation, meditation, mindfulness. And so there's where that kind of, you're detaching from those things that are bringing you that anxiety in that space, right? And giving you greater capacity. So yeah. I think that's really interesting that that the activism can bring you to such purpose, but with so much can kind of also bring with it so much anxiety and things that can derail us. I'm also curious in terms of, from my perspective too, the research you're doing around forgiveness and what forgiveness, how forgiveness plays into this idea of purpose and connection.
We've been doing forgiveness work for quite a while. It's mostly in conjunction. I have a very good friend at the University of Zurich, Dr. Matthias Allemond. And Dr. Allemond was the one who kind of turned me on to forgiveness work, and in part because it's such fascinating research to think about people who just kind of dispositionally forgive or forget. So we think of this from the very personality perspective of, there are some people who I shouldn't say in every situation, but across situations, we could think of people who, regardless of whether it was someone close to them or someone they never met, whether it was at work, whether it was home, like there's definitely people in our lives who tend to be more forgiving and have a more forgiving nature. And we've done a little bit of how this connects to purpose in the past, that, more forgiving people tend to also feel more affective and psychological well-being. So that's kind of connected to sense of purpose. But what's really been intriguing for us is to try to think through both the positives and the negatives of forgiveness. That there's certainly a lot of affective benefits to giving up a slight, like not holding a grudge, not being a vengeful person. We see in daily life, you tend to report more happiness, more positive emotions, less stress, less anxiety, and so forth. But we also know that there's a lot of work showing individuals who do this without like the contemplative piece, without the deliberation piece, sometimes are at vulnerability or risk to be reoffended. Like if you think about individuals in relationships who are always forgiving without like thinking through or talking it through and so forth, like they're at risk for reoffense and in some sometimes very traumatic cases. And what we've been doing recently, along with, again, with my postdoc, Dr. Wilson, is thinking about what forgiveness means for broader societal discussions. Like, if you're a more forgiving person, are you more or less likely to engage in activism, more or less likely to donate or to think about how to change the broader systemic system? And what's been interesting to us, which it's always funny to talk about, like, no association as being interesting, but we're not finding a huge connection there. That it's not that individuals who are very forgiving in their day-to-day life are just like putting the blinders on when it comes to these broader issues. Instead, it seems that forgiveness holds some benefits in your daily well-being, and maybe that helps you in some cases to be able, like we were talking before, to sustain a movement, to sustain going forward. So this is still some very early work, but again, we're kind of playing with this interesting back and forth where, depending on what you're interested in, forgiveness usually, like, I'm not going out there and saying, like, don't be a forgiving person, but yeah, being a forgiving person is usually good. But there does seem to be some, like, boundary conditions where we have to be careful when it's like particularly when you're in a vulnerable place with respect to a close partner or a close relationship, making sure that you're not just forgetting a transgression and letting things go without some kind of further discussion.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder, like, as you were describing it, it's sort of like, does forgiveness sort of operate, or it seems like it operates on a more individual, level versus, when you're talking about activism work or something that's looking at like systemic or a system, maybe it's like you see it in a different way that's not so interpersonal, like one-on-one. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it, that we, like, at least thus far, like, this notion of being a forgiving person may be more specific to your personal experiences in the moment. And, one thing that I know others have studied is trying to think about forgiveness at a more societal level, like your forgiveness of countries, nations, groups, and so forth. That might be another piece of the puzzle that we haven't yet explored. But yes, and related to the podcast, like, another element of this that we've been wrestling with is forgiveness. While it's broadly promoted by most religious doctrines and texts, it's promoted in different ways. It means different things, and there are different attitudes towards forgiveness based on your religious practice and your religious background. And some of those are more of the forgive and forget context. Some of those are more of the hold on to it, thinking about it more broad. So the whole discussion around religion and forgiveness leads to a whole like another can of worms that we've been trying to play with.
Well, and theory and practice are two very different things. I think, right? So if you look at a lot of the religious systems, and we don't see a lot of forgiveness being practiced in the world today.
That's a good the texts say something, but
yeah.
Thinking about your podcast, so I'm curious. So you mentioned your colleague, and it's Anthony Burrow. Is that's so he's your co-host. Can you tell us about that relationship? How you guys know each other? Why you decided to do a show?
So it's funny. It goes back to, again, this kind of serendipitous experience when we were I was at Notre Dame as a grad student when he was a postdoc, and we both just happened to start studying purpose together as part of this Notre Dame alumni study. And what happened was we just started, like, he does a lot of work and is very interested in, again, identity development, racial ethnic identity development, and this question of who am I and how did I get here? And with that in mind, like purpose was a nice meeting point of all of our interests. And I remember distinctly, like this was when we first submitted a project together as a potential grant proposal, like the first times that we heard about purpose were particularly infused with like the Notre Dame culture and some of the people there in the Civic Engagement Center. And part of us were like, literally like, oh, come on, this can't, like, really? This floaty, flighty thing, like purpose, who knows what this is? No one has any idea. And to this day, we're still finding it's a positive thing. So we were kind of starting off with this very skeptical standpoint, and have been sticking with it for quite a while. And eventually, you know, something that has been a blessing and a curse is so many groups and so many organizations are now promoting purpose in their advertisement materials, in their, like we see, oh gosh, what was it the other day? Like Jamba Juice or something had like something like blended material, whatever you call it. Smoothies. Yeah. That's what it is. Smoothies with a purpose. Yes, that's the word. And it's like, oh gosh, everybody's talking about purpose. And I think it really also came about, like, part of this is the pandemic context where it kind of took off during the pandemic at times, where a lot of people, we see this at universities too, like a lot of the pitch to get people back to university, like get students back in person, was around like, there are formative experiences on campus that may shape you and shape your identity development and so forth. And on one hand, again, this is very valuable for we don't have to do as much of a sales pitch around our construct as we used to have to do. But now there's a number, like with popularity comes a lot of people who are using it like smoothies with purpose in a way that we don't really think about it as scientists. So part of the podcast movement was it was the pandemic and we had nothing else to do, but B, it was to try to help inform the public or provide like a scientific perspective on this topic that is so everywhere. Like it's so in all of our like news reports and everything. And we've been trying to play with this a bit of like doing a follow-up podcast or doing other things in which we take events in the news or take things that pop up and it's like, okay, this, like, is this really purpose, or is this really like, how does this use of purpose that we see walking down the street map onto the scientific literature and such? So I think that's been a big catalyst of, in addition to just being bored at home, that was the reason we kind of started it, was to give people a more informed perspective if they want a more scientific perspective on the construct.
And to give you some purpose during a time of boredom.
Oh yeah, we were totally bored and lonely.
And that idea of it being memified everywhere. And oh yeah, that's crazy.
Is there a favorite episode, one that you would be like, if folks that are listening to this and they're like, I want to kind of check that out, what is there an episode you'd say this is the one I would listen to,
or start with this one?
Yes. You know, one thing that we had a lot of fun with was starting to interview other researchers, and even if they were not in the purpose field, asking them, like, I started every interview with the question of like, how did you find your direction, or how did you find your purpose? And one of my good friends and colleagues, Dr. Bill Chopik, did an interview with us, and I won't give it away, but had the best answer to that question in terms of just kind of a fun path and fun discussion of how he got to where he was. So that sticks out to me. Like, they're all the interviews were fascinating to me, way more so. Like Tony and I keep joking, like, it's way better to have a third person because nobody wants to hear the two of us talking. But
that's true.
So I promote those much more than I would the other.
We're the same way.
Us talking is more for us than for the audience. They can listen in, but well, that was a good teaser. We'll definitely
for sure. Now I'm very curious to hear that answer to that question.
Well, this was great.
Yeah.
Is there anything else, Erin, that you're...
I think we've gone through most of the questions that I had down here. Thank you so much for your time. This was really interesting.
So
this is delightful. Yes, thank you so much. I love this idea. Yeah.
We want to thank our guest, Dr. Patrick Hill, for joining us and sharing his work on finding meaning and purpose. We also thank our listeners for joining us for this episode. We hope you found Dr. Hill as fascinating as we did.
Be sure to check out this episode's description, where you'll find links to Dr. Hill's podcast and his Path Lab website. Atheist is produced by Justin Seiwell and Trend Media STL. You can follow us and other great podcasts on Instagram at STL Podcasts. Thank you for listening, and keep looking for connection.